The stone floor was cold enough to bruise, and Alira had been kneeling on it for an hour before anyone told her why. "You will wait here," the steward said, not looking at her. "The king does not receive war brides at the front gate." She had crossed 3 territories in a cart with no cover, past burned fields that used to belong to her pack, and now she knelt in a hallway made of gray stone, while men in uniforms walked past her like she was furniture waiting to be placed. Nobody had told her where her room would be. Nobody had told her if there would be a room at all. When the steward finally returned, he did not look pleased. He looked like a man carrying out a task he found slightly beneath him. "Follow me," he said. The castle was enormous, built from stone that seemed to swallow sound. Every hallway looked like the one before it, and Alira counted turns out of habit, the way she counted everything now. Left, right, down a narrow stair that smelled of damp, down another. By the time they stopped, they were somewhere she guessed was below the main floor of the castle, close enough to the kitchens that she could hear pots being scraped clean. The steward opened a low door tucked beneath a staircase. "Your room," he said. Alira looked inside, a cot with a thin blanket, a single shelf, no window, no fire. The stone walls were slick with old damp, and something in the corner had clearly died there once and been swept out, leaving only the smell behind. She did not ask if this was a mistake. She already knew it wasn't. "Thank you," she said, because saying nothing would have given him something to report. The steward left without another word, and Alira stood in the doorway of the smallest room she had ever been given, in the largest castle she had ever seen, and understood exactly what message this was meant to send. She was a debt, not a guest, not a bride in any sense that mattered. A number on a treaty, paid in a person, and placed accordingly. She sat on the cot. It creaked under her weight like it resented the intrusion. For a long moment she allowed herself exactly one feeling, and she chose anger, because anger was useful and grief was not. Grief would keep her sitting here. Anger would make her start paying attention. So she started paying attention. She noticed the door had no lock on her side, only a bolt on the outside, which told her this room had been used to keep people in before, not just to keep people out. She noticed a draft coming from somewhere near the shelf, which meant there was a gap in the stone she could not yet see. She noticed that the sound of the kitchens came through the wall clearly enough that she would be able to hear conversations she was never meant to hear. Small things. But small things were what she had. She did not cry that first night, though the room gave her every reason to. Instead, she took a piece of broken slate she found near the drain in the corner and scratched a single mark into the stone beside her cot. One night, she did not know yet how many marks would follow, only that she intended to count them, because counting was a way of proving to herself that time was still moving, even down here, where no one seemed to be watching the clock at all. The next morning, a young maid brought her a plate of bread and nothing else, set it down without meeting her eyes, and left just as quickly. "What's your name?" Alira asked, before the girl could vanish through the door. The maid paused, surprised to be spoken to at all. "Mira." "Thank you, Mira." Mira looked at her the way people look at something they've been told not to touch. Then she left, and the bolt slid shut on the outside of the door, though Alira noticed it wasn't fully latched. Careless, or deliberate, she filed the detail away. She ate the bread slowly, because there was nothing else to do with the day, and because eating slowly made the bread last longer in a way that felt like a small victory over a place designed to give her nothing. That afternoon, she heard footsteps in the hallway above the stairs, heavier than the servants' steps, unhurried in a way that suggested the person walking had never once in his life needed to hurry for anyone. She went to the door and pressed her eye to the gap where the bolt didn't quite meet the frame. A man passed at the top of the stairs, tall enough that he had to duck slightly under the low archway, dressed in dark clothing with no crown, no crest, nothing that announced him, and yet something about the way the 2 guards near him straightened told her exactly who he was before she even saw his face clearly. The Alpha King. He did not look toward the stairs. He did not look toward her door. He walked past the entrance to the lowest floor of his own castle, the way a man walks past a door he has decided does not need opening, and then he was gone, and the hallway went quiet again. Elira stepped back from the door. She had expected cruelty. She had prepared herself for cruelty the entire journey here, rehearsed responses to insults, built a kind of armor out of expecting the worst. What she had not prepared for was this: not cruelty, indifference. A king who did not even consider her enough of a person to be cruel to. Somehow that was worse. She sat back down on the cot and stared at the single mark she had scratched into the wall the night before. One, she said out loud, to no one, because there was no one to say it to. Only one. Over the following days, she learned the rhythm of the lowest floor the way she had once learned the rhythm of her old pack's border patrols, back before the war had taken the border and the pack along with it. She learned when the kitchen staff changed shifts. She learned that the guard posted nearest the servant's stair fell asleep sitting up sometime after midnight, and that no one ever checked on him until morning. She learned that the door at the end of the kitchen corridor, the one that led out toward the stable yard, stuck in its frame and never quite closed all the way, no matter how many times someone tried to shut it properly. She told herself she was only paying attention. She told herself this the way she told herself many things during that first week, carefully, like handling something with a sharp edge. She was not planning anything, not yet. She was only noticing. On the fifth night, she scratched a fifth mark into the wall, and for the first time allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, what it would feel like to walk through that stable door and keep walking until the castle was nothing but a shape behind her. She did not let herself imagine it for long, long enough to know the shape of the wanting, not long enough to call it a plan. Mira came again the next morning with bread, and this time a small piece of dried meat alongside it, more than Elira had been given before. Someone said to bring extra, Mira said quietly, glancing back toward the door, as if afraid of being overheard. Who said that? Mira shook her head, refusing to answer, and left before Elira could press her further. Elira looked down at the extra piece of meat on her plate and felt something complicated stir in her chest, something she did not have a name for yet and did not particularly want one for. She told herself it meant nothing. Kitchens sometimes had extra food. Servants sometimes acted on their own kindness, without anyone above them ordering it. She told herself this, and mostly believed it, and ate the meat slowly, the way she ate everything now, because slow was the only pace this room allowed her, and because some stubborn part of her had decided that she would not let this castle rush her into anything, not gratitude, not despair, not even hope. That night she scratched a sixth mark into the wall and lay on the thin cot listening to the muffled sounds of the kitchen through the stone, and thought, for reasons she could not fully explain to herself, of the tall man who had walked past her door without looking, and wondered what exactly he had been avoiding. She did not know yet that the answer to that question would take a year to find. She only knew, lying there in the dark, counting marks on a wall in the lowest room of a castle that was not her home, that something about this place had already started to change the shape of her, quietly, one overlooked day at a time. 3 weeks in, Elira knew the lowest floor of the castle better than most people who had lived there their entire lives. She knew which floorboards near the pantry creaked, and which ones stayed silent. She knew that the guard named Bram, who fell asleep at his post after midnight, snored loud enough to cover the sound of a door opening 2 rooms away. She knew that the cook, a broad woman named Dara, hummed old songs from the northern villages while she worked, and that if Elira listened closely enough through the wall, she could tell what mood the kitchen was in before she ever stepped outside her door. None of this had turned into a plan yet. She still told herself that, but she had started keeping a small collection of things in the gap behind her shelf, things that seemed useless on their own but might matter later. A stub of candle, a folded scrap of cloth, a rusted nail she had found near the drain, sharp enough to be useful, dull enough that no one would think to take it from her if they searched the room, which they never did, because no one down here believed she was worth searching. That, more than anything, told her how little she mattered to them. and that, more than anything, was becoming useful. The firewood arrived on a Tuesday, though she did not think of it as unusual until later. A boy she didn't recognize dropped an armful of split logs beside her door, more than she had ever been given before, enough to keep a small fire going for days instead of hours. "There's been a mistake," she told him, because rooms like hers were not given firewood at all, not this much, and mistakes in a castle like this one tended to be corrected quickly, usually by taking things away rather than adding them. The boy shrugged. "Told to bring it here. Not my business to ask why." He left before she could ask anything else, and Alira stood over the small pile of wood for a long moment, turning the mystery over the way she turned over everything now, looking for the sharp edge, the catch, the reason someone would give more to a room that was designed to give nothing. She built a fire that night for the first time since arriving, and the warmth of it against the damp stone felt almost indecent, like she was stealing something she hadn't earned. She scratched her 21st mark into the wall by firelight and thought, not for the first time, that someone in this castle was watching her more closely than anyone had bothered to tell her. She had gone to the kitchen corridor after midnight, past Bram's familiar snoring, meaning only to check the stable door, the one that never closed properly, to see if it had been fixed or if it still gave the same half-inch of give it always had. She was not planning to leave. She told herself this every single time, and every single time it was slightly less true than the time before. A voice stopped her before she reached the door. "You're out of your room." She turned, and there he was, the tall man from the stairs, the one who had walked past her without a glance that first day, standing near the kitchen hearth with a cup of something in his hand, looking at her now the way he had very deliberately not looked at her before. Up close, he was harder to read than she expected. Not cold exactly, guarded, like a door that had been shut so many times the hinges had forgotten how to swing easily. "I was checking the door," she said, because lying seemed pointless, and the truth, at least, gave nothing away. "It doesn't close properly. I'm aware. You could have it fixed." "I could." He didn't elaborate, and something in the way he said it made her understand that the broken door was not an oversight either. She studied him for a moment, this king who gave firewood to a room he'd assigned to insult her, who left doors broken that might otherwise trap her, who walked past her the first day like she didn't exist, and now stood 3 feet away at midnight discussing hinges like it was the most natural conversation in the world. "Why the wood?" she asked, deciding to be direct, because indirect had gotten her nowhere in 3 weeks. There was extra. There's never extra in a castle like this. Someone always finds a use for extra. Something flickered across his face, there and gone before she could name it. "Then consider it a clerical error you're welcome to benefit from." She almost smiled. Almost. "You're a very bad liar for a king." "I'm told that often." He set down his cup. "You should go back to your room before Bram wakes and reports you for wandering." "Bram won't wake before dawn. I've timed it." That earned her something close to a real reaction, a slight rise of his eyebrows, quickly smoothed away. "You've timed it. I have very little else to do down there." He looked at her for a long moment then, and she had the strange sensation of being truly seen for the first time since she'd arrived. Not as a treaty payment, not as a war bride, not as a problem to be housed and forgotten, but as a person standing in front of him who had apparently spent 3 weeks mapping his castle out of sheer boredom and stubbornness. "Go back to your room," he said again, but softer this time, and she went, because there was nothing else to do with the moment, and because some part of her wanted to leave it exactly as it was, unfinished, rather than push it toward an ending she couldn't predict. She did not mention his brother that night. That came later, almost by accident, on a night nearly 2 months into her stay, when the fire had burned low, and neither of them seemed inclined to end the conversation the way they usually did. They had fallen into a pattern by then, the two of them, never planned, never acknowledged out loud. Some nights after Bram's snoring started, she would find him in the kitchen, or he would find her, and they would talk about nothing that mattered, the state of the roads, the price of grain, the particular stubbornness of the stable door, and neither of them ever called it what it was. "You had a brother," she said that night, not as a question. She'd heard it from Mira, who'd heard it from someone else, the way things traveled through a castle's lower floors like water finding the lowest point. Roderick went very still. "I did." "What happened to him?" "He died." 2 words, flat, offered like a closed door rather than an open one. 10 years ago. She waited for more. It didn't come. He looked at the fire instead of at her, and something in his jaw was doing work she recognized, the particular effort of holding something shut that wanted very badly to open. She did not push. She had learned, in 3 weeks of counting marks on a wall, that some doors opened faster when you stopped pulling on them. "I'm sorry," she said instead, and meant it, and let the subject go the way he clearly needed her to. He glanced at her then, surprised, she thought, that she hadn't asked for more, and something in his shoulders loosened slightly, like a man who had braced for an interrogation and received a mercy instead. "Thank you," he said, and it was the most honest thing she had heard him say since she'd arrived. Weeks passed after that, in a rhythm that felt, against every reasonable expectation, almost comfortable. Firewood kept appearing, more than a clerical error could explain away twice. A physician visited her room once, unbidden, when a winter cough had settled into her chest, and left a tonic that tasted like bitter herbs, and worked within 2 days. Mira brought better bread, and once, on a day Elira never learned the reason for, a small orange, the first fresh fruit she'd had since the journey to the castle began. She told herself these were castle policies. She told herself the physician visited everyone, that the fruit was a surplus from someone's harvest, that firewood simply appeared for rooms that needed it. She stopped quite believing herself somewhere around the orange. One evening in the kitchen, months into this unspoken arrangement, she found a small carved wolf sitting on the edge of the hearth, where she always sat, no note beside it, no explanation, just a piece of wood, shaped with obvious care, into something that looked less like a weapon and more like a promise. She did not ask him about it directly. When he arrived that night, later than usual, she simply held it up, turning it in the firelight, and watched his face for whatever it would give her. He didn't deny it, he didn't confirm it either. He only looked at the wolf in her hand for a long moment, then back at the fire, and said nothing at all, which told her everything she needed to know. She kept the wolf. She did not scratch a mark into the wall that night. For the first time since arriving, she forgot to count. The council chamber sat 2 floors above Elira's room, close enough that on certain nights, when the great hall was empty and sound carried strangely through old stone, she could hear pieces of what was said there, fragments only, enough to build a shape, but never the whole picture. She was not listening for anything in particular the night it happened. She had gone up the back stair toward the kitchen out of habit, later than usual, and the voices reached her before she rounded the final corner, sharp enough that she stopped without meaning to. "The girl has been here 4 months, a man's voice said, one she recognized as belonging to Colm, a council elder with a reputation for saying difficult things in a pleasant voice. 4 months, and no formal arrangement. The northern lords are asking why their king delays." "It is not a delay," Roderick's voice answered, tight in a way she had not heard from him before, not even that first night by the fire. "It is a decision I have not yet made." "There is no decision to make," Colm said. "She is leverage. Formalize the marriage, secure the northern border, and the treaty holds for a generation. Sentiment is a luxury a king in your position cannot afford." Elira stood very still in the corridor, one hand against the cold stone wall, and let the words settle over her the way cold water settles over skin, slow and complete, and impossible to unfeel once it has soaked through. Leverage. 4 months of firewood and tonics and a carved wolf on a hearth, and underneath all of it, apparently, she was still exactly what she had been the day she arrived. A number on a treaty, a tool for securing a border, a word a council elder could say in a pleasant voice without once considering that she might be standing close enough to hear it. She did not wait to hear Roderick's answer. She turned and went back down the stairs the way she had come, quietly, the way she had learned to move through this castle over 4 months of paying attention to things no one thought she noticed. That night, she did not build a fire. She sat on the cot in the dark and turned the carved wolf over in her hands, and told herself, with the same flat certainty she'd used to catalog the insults of her first night here, that she had been foolish to let herself forget what this castle actually was. A place built on treaties and leverage and border disputes, where kindness could exist alongside cruelty, sincerity alongside strategy, and a person like her would never fully know which one she was standing inside of at any given moment. She scratched a mark into the wall. She had lost count of the real number months ago, somewhere around the orange, but she made this one deliberately, a hard line pressed into stone, because she needed the motion of counting back, needed the reminder that time in this room was still something she was tracking, even now, even after everything. She did not confront Roderick about what she'd heard. She told herself this was strategy, not cowardice, though some nights she wasn't entirely sure of the difference. If he knew she'd heard, he would explain, and explanations from a man who clearly meant some of his kindness, and calculated the rest of it were the last thing she could afford to sit through right now. She did not trust herself to hear him out and still walk away clear-headed, and clear-headed was the only way she was going to survive whatever came next. For 2 weeks, she went on as before. She met him by the fire when Bram's snoring covered the hour. She let him talk about grain prices and stubborn doors. She did not mention the council chamber, and if he noticed anything different in her, some new distance she couldn't quite hide, he didn't ask about it, and she was grateful for that, because she didn't have an honest answer ready. The formal announcement came on a gray morning in early spring, delivered not by Roderick but by the steward, standing in her doorway with the same flat expression he'd worn the day he first showed her this room. "The king will be moving you to proper chambers within the week," the steward said. "There will be a formal ceremony to follow, once the council has set a date." Elira nodded, because there was nothing else to do with the news, and the steward left, and she sat on the cot she had slept on for 4 months, and understood that everything was about to change, whether or not she had any say in the shape of that change. She thought about the word leverage, she thought about proper chambers, and formal ceremonies, and council dates, all of it decided somewhere above her, about her, without her, the exact same way her arrival here had been decided months before she'd ever set foot in this castle. She thought about the carved wolf sitting on her single shelf. She did not decide that night to leave. She wanted to be honest with herself about that later, whenever later came. The decision built itself slowly, the way water finds a crack in stone and simply keeps finding it, day after day, until eventually the crack is a passage and the stone has no choice left in the matter. 3 nights after the steward's announcement, Roderick came to the kitchen later than usual, and something in the careful way he moved, the way he chose his first words, told her before he spoke that this conversation would be different from all the ones before it. "I've asked for you to be moved," he said. "Proper chambers, near the east wing. I heard. I should have done it months ago." He looked at the fire instead of at her, the same way he had the night he'd told her about his brother, and she recognized the posture now, a man working to keep a door shut that badly wanted to open. "There's no excuse good enough for how long I let it go. I told myself I was protecting you from the council's attention. That wasn't the whole truth." What was the whole truth? He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. "I didn't know how to want something out loud," he said finally. "Where I was raised, an alpha who shows the pack what he wants has already lost something he can't get back. I don't know how to do this the way it's supposed to be done. I only know how to leave firewood and hope it says something I can't say directly." It was the most he had ever given her at once, and some part of her, the part that had spent 4 months collecting small kindnesses like the collection of odd useful things behind her shelf, wanted badly to reach across the distance between them and tell him it was enough, that she understood, that the firewood and the tonic and the carved wolf had said more than most people managed to say with 100 honest words. But she thought of Colm's voice, calling her leverage in a pleasant tone, and she thought of a council setting a date for her future without once asking what she wanted her future to be, and the wanting stayed exactly where it was, unspoken, because she no longer trusted herself to separate what was real in this castle from what was simply useful. "Thank you for telling me," she said instead, and it was true, and it was also nowhere near everything she felt, and she let the gap between those two things stand without explaining it, because explaining it would have meant staying in this conversation longer than she could bear to. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'll have them move your things. It isn't much of an apology, but it's a start." "Tomorrow," she agreed, and something in her chest ached at the word, because she already knew, standing there in the kitchen with the fire burning low, that she would not be in this castle tomorrow to see whether he kept the promise. He left first that night, an unusual reversal of their pattern, called away by some matter qualms people had raised that couldn't wait until morning. She watched him go, memorizing the particular way he moved through a doorway, shoulders slightly lowered, as if bracing for a ceiling too low for him, though the doorway was more than tall enough. She went back to her room and did not sleep. Instead, she took stock of everything she had gathered over 4 months in the gap behind her shelf. The candle stub, the folded cloth, the rusted nail, useful for prying at things that didn't want to open. She added the carved wolf to the small collection, wrapped carefully in the cloth, because whatever else happened tonight, she was not leaving that behind. Near midnight, she heard Bram's snoring start on schedule, familiar as a clock striking the hour, and she understood that her own body had already decided what her mind kept pretending was still an open question. She dressed in the plainest clothes she owned, the same ones she had arrived in, worn soft now from 4 months of use, and she stood in the doorway of the smallest room in the castle for a long moment, looking back at the cot, the shelf, the wall covered in scratched marks. She had stopped fully trusting the count of somewhere around the 2nd month. She thought, for one unsteady moment, of turning back, of waiting for tomorrow and the proper chambers, and whatever honest conversation might follow once she had the safety of walls that weren't damp and a door that locked from the inside instead of out. She thought of the fire in the kitchen, and grain prices, and stubborn doors, and a man who left firewood because he didn't know how to say what he meant any other way. Then she thought of the word leverage, said in a pleasant voice by a man who would never once in his life be asked to give something up for a treaty, and the moment of turning back closed as quietly as it had opened. She walked the route she had mapped 4 months ago, past Bram's steady, oblivious snoring, down the kitchen corridor where Dara's songs still seemed to hang faintly in the cold air even though the kitchen itself was empty and dark, toward the stable door that had never once, in 4 months, been properly fixed. She paused there with her hand against the wood, feeling the familiar half-inch of give in the frame, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost cruel, that he had never fixed that door because some part of him had always wanted her to have a way out, even while another part of him wanted her to stay badly enough to leave a carved wolf on a hearth with no note attached. Both things were true. She had learned, over 4 months in the lowest room of his castle, that most true things about this man came in matched, contradictory pairs. She pushed the door open into the cold stable yard, and the night air hit her face like something almost gentle, and she did not look back at the castle rising dark and enormous behind her. By the time the eastern sky had gone from black to the deep blue that comes just before real light, Elira was well past the outer wall, moving fast along a road she had never walked in daylight, but had somehow, through 4 months of listening at walls and mapping corridors out of pure stubbornness, already learned enough about to navigate in the dark. She did not know yet how far she would have to go before she stopped hearing Bram's snoring in her memory, before the smell of that damp lowest room stopped clinging to the folded cloth in her bag alongside the carved wolf. She only knew that dawn was coming, and that whatever waited for her in the proper chambers of Castle Ashgrave, whatever apology or ceremony or council date, had already been decided somewhere above her without her. She would not be there to receive it. Behind her, in a castle just beginning to stir awake, a king would soon walk down a familiar stair to a door he had promised, only the day before, to finally open properly, and find the smallest room in his castle exactly as empty as the day she'd arrived, save for a single wall covered in scratched marks and a shelf with nothing left on it at all. Roderick found the empty room himself. He had gone down the back stair that morning with a set of instructions already forming in his mind, which servants would carry her things to the east wing, which fire would need building first in her new chambers, and instead he found the cot untouched since the night before, the shelf bare, the stable door standing open just wide enough for one person to have slipped through it. He stood in the doorway for a long time, long enough that Mira, coming down with the morning bread, found him there and understood, without being told, that something had gone wrong in a way bread could not fix. He did not shout. He did not send guards running in every direction, though that would come soon enough. He stood very still, looking at the marks scratched into the stone wall, more of them than he had realized, more nights counted alone in the dark than he had let himself think about while he was busy telling himself firewood and tonics were enough. They were not enough. He understood that now, standing in a room that had taught her, patiently and thoroughly, exactly how little she mattered to everyone in this castle, except, apparently, not quite enough to him. The search began within the hour, and it did not stop for a year. At first it was ordinary, guards on the roads, questions at the border posts, a description of a woman with dark hair, and a particular careful way of watching a room before she stepped into it, sent to every outpost within 3 days' ride. Roderick expected, in those early weeks, that she would be found quickly. The northern roads were watched closely since the war, and a lone traveler tended to stand out. She was not found quickly. She was not found at all, not for a long time, and each week that passed without word did something to Roderick that the council noticed long before he was willing to admit it himself. Calm raised the matter directly, 3 weeks in the same pleasant voice he used for everything. The border treaty was never formalized. Perhaps it's time to consider other arrangements. No, Roderick said, and something in the flatness of the word made Colm decide, wisely, not to raise the matter again for some time. He kept her room exactly as she'd left it. He gave no order for this. He simply never gave the order to change it, and eventually the staff understood, without being told, that the smallest room beneath the east stair was not to be touched, not cleared, not filled with anyone else, not even swept, as though clearing away the dust might somehow clear away the last trace of her too. Months passed this way. Reports came in fragments, always too late, always pointing somewhere she had already left. A healer in a border village who matched her description had treated a fever outbreak and moved on before anyone could confirm it was her. A woman selling herbs at a market 3 territories east had a particular way of counting coins twice before handing them over, a habit a merchant remembered clearly enough to mention to a passing guard, though by the time anyone arrived to ask further questions, she was gone again. Roderick read every report himself. He stopped delegating this task to his stewards somewhere around the 4th month, unwilling to trust anyone else to catch the detail that might matter, the small overlooked thing that would tell him where she'd gone next. He became, in the court's quiet estimation, a different kind of king than the one who had walked past a war bride's door without a glance on her first day in this castle. The change was not loud. It showed itself in small ways, an alpha who used to want nothing out loud, now sending riders out personally, questioning merchants himself instead of waiting for reports to filter up through proper channels, standing at the border wall some evenings, simply looking north, as if looking hard enough might make the distance shorter. He did not talk about her to the council, not directly, not in a way anyone could report back as sentiment interfering with duty. But Mira, who still worked in the kitchens, mentioned once to another servant that the king had taken to sitting by the same hearth some nights, the one where a carved wolf used to sit, and staying there long after the fire had burned down to coals, saying nothing to anyone, simply sitting. On nights like that, anger became something he reached for on purpose, because anger was easier to hold than the alternative. He had learned this about himself slowly, the way a man learns the shape of an old injury by which movements make it ache. Grief sat in his chest like something too large for the space it occupied, but anger, when he let it in, moved through him fast and hot and familiar, burned itself out within an hour, and left him steadier than he'd been before it arrived. He did not examine too closely what that said about him. He simply reached for it on the nights he needed steadying, the way another man might reach for a drink, and told himself it wasn't the same thing as feeling nothing. The 6th month brought the closest thing to real news. A trader coming through the eastern gate mentioned, almost in passing, a woman running a small shop in a border town 3 days south, selling remedies and simple medicines, who kept careful accounts and rarely spoke of where she'd come from. She went, the trader said, by a name that wasn't Elira, though something about the careful way she moved, the way she watched a room before stepping fully into it, reminded him of a description he'd heard passed around at a previous stop. Roderick rode out himself within the hour, taking only 2 guards, moving faster than dignity usually allowed a king to move. The town, when he reached it, was small and unremarkable, the kind of place people passed through rather than stayed in, which made it, he understood immediately, exactly the sort of place a person might choose if they wanted to be forgettable. The shop the trader described had closed its shutters 2 days before his arrival. The woman who ran it, according to the neighbors, had left without warning, without explanation, taking almost nothing with her, the same way she had apparently arrived. Roderick stood in front of the empty shop for a long time, the same stillness settling over him that had settled that first morning in the empty room beneath his own stairs, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost like penance, that she was staying exactly 1 step ahead of him on purpose, moving the moment she sensed the search getting close, and that this told him something important he had been too slow to understand. She did not want to be found by force. She wanted, if she was ever found at all, to be found on terms that were hers. He rode back to the castle slower than he'd ridden out. The 7th and 8th months brought nothing at all, no reports, no fragments, no near misses, only silence that stretched long enough that even Roderick's most loyal guards began to speak carefully around him about the possibility of ending the search, redirecting resources toward the border treaty the council still badly wanted resolved. He did not end the search. He simply stopped announcing its scale, moved it quieter, kept 2 riders posted permanently near the southern roads with standing instructions to send word the moment anything, however small, surfaced. In the 9th month, his own steward, the same man who had shown her to the lowest room on her first day, came to him with an unusual request. He wished, he said, to be relieved of his position. When Roderick asked why, the man admitted, with obvious discomfort, that he had never forgiven himself for the room he'd assigned her that first day, had watched the king's year-long search with a guilt he could no longer carry quietly. Roderick did not accept the resignation. Instead, he had the man oversee, personally, the long-overdue work of clearing out and rebuilding the lowest room beneath the east stair, not to erase what had happened there, but because leaving it exactly as it was had started to feel less like memory and more like a wound he was refusing to let close. They found, taking up the old stone floor, a small drainage gap near the corner that had let in the worst of the winter damp for as long as anyone could remember. The same draft Elira had noticed her very first night. It was fixed within a day, something that should have been fixed years before she ever arrived, and Roderick stood in the newly opened room and thought, not for the first time, about how many small, overlooked things in this castle had needed fixing long before anyone bothered to notice them. By the 10th month, the reports had thinned to almost nothing, and Roderick had begun, quietly, without telling anyone, to widen the search himself, riding out personally to towns the official reports hadn't reached yet, following instinct more than evidence, driven by a certainty he couldn't fully explain even to himself, that she was still moving, still 1 town ahead, still choosing, every single time, not to be caught. He carried, on these rides, a small object wrapped carefully in cloth, a second carving he had made himself in the long, sleepless months of searching. Another wolf, smaller than the first, rougher around the edges because his hands had shaken more than he wanted to admit while he worked on it. He did not know, riding south again in the 11th month, on another fragment of a rumor too thin to properly call a lead, that this ride would be different from all the ones before it. He only knew that he intended to keep riding, town after town, season after season, for as long as it took, because he had finally understood, a full year too late by anyone's reasonable measure, exactly what he had let stand unaddressed in the lowest room of his own castle, and exactly what it had cost the both of them. The town was called Ferndale, small enough that most maps didn't bother naming it, tucked against a river crossing that saw more traders passing through than staying. Roderick had learned, over a year of following fragments that mostly led nowhere, not to expect much from any single lead. This one had come from a healer 2 towns north, who mentioned a woman who kept careful accounts and had a particular habit of watching a doorway before ever stepping through it, the same small detail that had followed him now through half a dozen towns and just as many disappointments. He rode in with 1 guard this time, dressed plainly, no crest, no crown, the same way he preferred to move through his own castle when he didn't want to be recognized. The shop was easy enough to find, a narrow building near the river crossing with dried herbs hanging in the window, and a small hand-lettered sign that gave no name at all, only the word remedies. He stood outside for a long moment before going in, longer than made sense for a man who had ridden a year for exactly this moment. When he finally opened the door, the woman behind the counter looked up, and it was her, older around the eyes than the memory he'd carried for a year, steadier somehow, a woman who had built something of her own, in a town with no name worth putting on a map. She did not look surprised to see him. That, more than anything, told him she had known, on some level, that this moment was always going to arrive eventually, and had simply decided, at some point in the last year, to stop running from the knowing. "You found me," she said. "Not by hunting," he answered. "I think you let me." She didn't confirm it, but she didn't deny it either, and the silence between them did the work that words usually did in other conversations. He did not reach for her. He did not launch into the apology he had rehearsed 100 times on 100 different roads, the one that started with the room and ended somewhere in the 11th month of searching. Instead, he did the only thing that felt honest in the moment. He sat down on the small bench near her counter, the way a man sits when he intends to wait for as long as it takes to be told whether he's welcome to stay. "I'm not here to take you back," he said. "Not by any right I have left to claim. I came because I needed you to know the search never stopped, and because I owed you an explanation you never got before you left." "I heard the explanation already," she said. "From the council chamber. Leverage. That was thorough enough." His jaw tightened, and for a moment, the anger he'd learned to reach for on hard nights rose in him fast and familiar, not at her, but at himself, at Calm, at a year that had needed to happen because he hadn't found the courage to say what he meant while there was still time for it to matter. "That was Calm's word," he said, "not mine. I never once thought of you that way, not from the second week, maybe not even the first, but I understand why you had no way of knowing that. Standing in a hallway, hearing it said in a voice pleasant enough to make it sound reasonable. You didn't correct him. Not that night. Not after." "No," he admitted, "I didn't. I told myself silence was safer than giving the council anything to use against either of us. I understand now that silence cost you something I can't undo by explaining it a year later." She was quiet for a long moment, turning a small jar of dried herbs over in her hands, the same careful, deliberate motion he remembered from 4 months of firelit conversations that never quite said what either of them meant. "The room," she said finally. "Did you have it cleared?" "Rebuilt," he said. "There was a gap in the stone, near the corner, that let the winter damp through every year you were there. It's fixed now. Should have been fixed a decade before you ever arrived." Something shifted in her face at that. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but something adjacent to it, the recognition of a man who had gone looking for the actual wound instead of simply painting over the wall around it. "I kept something," he said, and drew from inside his coat the second carving, smaller and rougher than the first, wrapped in the same careful cloth. I made it somewhere around the 6th month, on a night the search had gone quiet, and I needed something to do with my hands besides nothing. She took it from him and turned it over, comparing it, he guessed, to the one she still carried, the one she'd taken from the windowsill the night she left. She said nothing about it. She set it down on the counter beside the jar of herbs, not rejecting it, not fully accepting it either, and the gap between those two things sat open between them, unresolved, exactly the way most true things about the two of them had always insisted on staying. "I'm not the same person who left that room," she said. "I built something here, a name that isn't mine, a shop that is, accounts I keep myself, a door that locks from the inside because I decided it should, not because anyone else decided it for me. I know. If I come back, it isn't as a treaty, not as leverage, formalized or otherwise, not as a war bride finally given proper chambers a year too late. I know that too," he said. "I didn't ride a year to collect a debt. I rode a year because somewhere in the 2nd month I stopped being able to tell the difference between searching for you and simply needing you to know you'd mattered enough to be searched for." The words landed between them, and neither of them rushed to fill the quiet that followed. Outside, the river moved past the window with the same steady indifference it had shown for longer than either of their lifetimes, and somewhere down the street, a merchant called out prices to no one in particular, and the ordinary sounds of an ordinary town wrapped around a conversation that was, for both of them, anything but ordinary. "I need time," she said finally, "not another year, but time." "You can have all of it," he said. "I've gotten good at waiting." She almost smiled at that, the first real crack in the careful composure she'd worn since he'd walked through her door, and something in his chest loosened at the sight of it, the same way it had loosened months ago in a castle kitchen when she'd chosen not to push him about his brother. He did not stay in Ferndale that first day. He left before evening, giving her exactly the space she'd asked for, though he left word with the guard posted quietly at the edge of town that any message from the shop with no name should reach him within the hour, day or night, however long it took. It took 3 weeks. The message that finally came was short, delivered by a rider who'd clearly been told to say nothing beyond the words themselves. She would return to Ashgrave, not as a treaty, not as a formal arrangement the council could point to as proof of a border secured, on her own terms, in her own time, and only for as long as those terms continued to be respected. Roderick agreed before the rider had finished speaking. She arrived at the castle on a gray morning, much like the one that had first brought her there over a year before, except this time she walked through the front gate rather than being led around to a servant's entrance, and this time Roderick himself stood waiting at the top of the steps instead of somewhere else in the castle, deliberately looking away. The council, when they finally learned the terms of her return, were considerably less pleased than they'd hoped to be, and Calm in particular found himself informed, in a voice far less pleasant than his own usually managed, that the word leverage would not be spoken in this castle again in reference to her, under any circumstance, by anyone who wished to remain on the council at all. The lowest room beneath the east stair had been transformed entirely by then, the damp gone, the drainage gap sealed, new stone laid over old, and Alira asked to see it before she agreed to move into anything else the castle had to offer. She stood in the doorway of the room that used to hold nothing but a cot and a shelf, and a wall she'd scratched into every night for 4 months, and found instead a bright, dry space with a proper window that hadn't existed before, looking out over the same stable yard she had once slipped through in the dark before dawn. "I want this room," she said. Roderick, standing behind her, sounded surprised despite himself. "There are far better chambers in the east wing." "I know, I want this one." She stepped inside, running her hand along the new stone where the old damp corner used to be. "Not because it's small, because it's the one thing in this castle that actually got fixed instead of simply excused." He didn't argue further. He had learned, over a year of searching and 3 weeks of careful waiting, that arguing with her instincts about what a room could mean had never once worked out well for him. There was one condition she added before she'd fully agree to make the room hers, and she stated it plainly, the way she'd learned to state everything since Ferndale, without softening it into something easier to hear. "The door locks from the inside," she said. "Not from the outside. Never again from the outside. That's not a punishment for anyone. That's proof, every single day, that staying is a choice I'm making, not a condition someone else is enforcing on me." Roderick had a locksmith brought in within the week and stood in the doorway himself while the man worked, watching the old bolt, the one that had only ever locked from outside, come away from the frame for good. The carved wolf, the first one, went back to its place on the new windowsill, no longer alone. The second one, smaller and rougher, sat beside it, and neither of them ever explained to the staff, or to the council, or even fully to each other, exactly what the two small carvings were meant to represent, and neither of them ever felt the need to. Some nights, long after the castle had gone quiet, Roderick still found himself sitting by the kitchen hearth out of old habit, and some nights Elira joined him there, and they talked about nothing that mattered, the state of the roads, the price of grain, whether the stable door still stuck in its frame the way it always had. It did. Neither of them ever asked to have it fixed.